We've been going through our end time study. We have completed the second coming of Christ. Christ has returned, and there is a 7-day period between Christ coming, Armageddon. So those are the same events, all coinciding together. Christ coming, Armageddon occurring, and then there's 75 days between that point in time to when the millennial kingdom starts. So there's a 1,000-year reign of Christ after the Great Tribulation. But there is a 75-day period. And so we talked about what occurs during the 75 days. The Bible doesn't specifically tell us what happens. It just gives us a timeline and know that after the 75 days that you'll be blessed, it'll be great, you've made it through the tribulation. But we've talked about how after the nations have gone to war against God, that the world needs to be cleaned up from that. We've talked about how the Temple Mount needs to be cleared and the Tribulation Temple cleared out and be prepared for the new millennial temple. We talked about the judgment of the sheep and the goats, where the unbelievers and believers that made it through the tribulation period will be split, and the believers will enter into the millennial kingdom. The unbelievers will be sent to the lake of fire forever and ever. We've talked about specifically about the Jewish people. A similar situation will occur with there. Those who trusted in Christ will enter the millennial kingdom, and those who did not will enter into the lake of fire forever and ever. The Antichrist, the false prophet are in the lake of fire at this moment. Satan is bound in the bottomless pit. He is not in the lake of fire during this moment, during this 1,000-year reign. He'll be released after 1,000 years. We've talked about the resurrection of the Old Testament saints, Old Testament believers, and the tribulation believers. Their bodies will be joined with their spirits, and they will enter into the millennial kingdom. So at this moment in time, as the government, the Lord's government is being set up, and everything being arranged and set up, that only believers will be in the millennial kingdom. Now there's tribulation believers, living believers, mortals, we'll call them mortals, that made it through the tribulation and were living, and they're believers. They will continue to marry and have children. Those children will then have an opportunity to accept or reject Christ. So as time moves along, there will be unbelievers in the millennial kingdom. That is kind of a sad case. We've talked about Satan has been removed, so you cannot blame the devil for sinning. Because at this moment in time, the devil won't be there. He won't have an influence. So you can't say the devil made me do it. That is not an excuse. Because we'll see for sure and prove it during the millennial kingdom. And for those of us, we will have raptured and been in heaven, and we will have returned with Christ during the second coming of Christ. So gloriously as Armageddon, we'll be a witness to Armageddon. We'll fight in Armageddon. We'll be able to see Christ win Armageddon, which won't take too long. And we will be with him. We'll be given opportunities to have positions of government in the Lord's government during that time. So that's where brings you back up to speed on where we are in the tribulation period. One of the big things with the millennial kingdom fulfills the prophecies, the covenants God made to the people of Israel. And so one of those is the nation of Israel, the borders of Israel. And if you've known over time, the nation of Israel, the borders have been disputed, and in fact, most of the world does not recognize Israel as a nation. Particularly the Arab nations around do not recognize Israel as a nation. That's a big issue. And so there's fight and squabbles over land. And right now, when Israel became a nation in 1948, there's been many different battles that have taken place, and borders have moved and shifted. There's been compromises. There's been talk of a nation of two states. There's been, so Palestine is taking up Gaza and the Western Bank. So there's been all kinds of different squabbles. But the Lord, during the millennial kingdom, will have set the borders of Israel as he discussed it and promised Moses in Numbers, and as promised Ezekiel in Ezekiel. So the nation of Israel will have the borders that God had promised them. And so we talked about the borders last week. And in Numbers, the borders starts off with different points coming from the south, going to the north. In Ezekiel, starts from the north and heading to the south. Some of the points that are referenced, we do not know where that location is, but we can have a general idea. and Numbers and Ezekiel are synonymous together. There may be some different points that are kind of different, but we don't quite know exactly where they are, but we have a general idea. We know for sure that the Mediterranean Sea is the western border, and we know for sure the Jordan River is the eastern border. So if you're familiar with the promised land, is this where I want it? The promised land, the promise given to the tribes of the inheritance of the tribes during the time of Joshua. 2.5 tribes actually took land on the east side of Jordan River. That was not a part of the promised land. So actually the promised land that they have is going to be a little smaller than what they had during the time of Joshua, because this was not promised to them. So that's kind of interesting. What we do seem to find is that today, present day, Israel is here, this green. This is Lebanon, so it looks like most of Lebanon will be a part of the promised land, and part of Syria will be a part of the promised land. So those are areas that are not currently within the state of Israel at the moment, and of course all of Gaza and the West Bank will be part of Israel. Also, this is the Red Sea down here, and Israel goes down the Red Sea. There's a major port city, so Israel has access to the Indian Ocean through the Red Sea. It does not appear that that border will extend down to the Red Sea. I also need to point out, during the tribulation, there will be many major great earthquakes that on a scale that has not ever occurred on record, will occur during the tribulation period, and land will change and adjust. We know specifically Jerusalem will be raised and be flattened. For Jerusalem, the Mount of Olives will be split in two. So we know that there's going to be topographical changes, which may result in why we don't know where some of these locations are. They either are lost in time, given Ezekiel would have known where they were, and now they're lost in time, or topographical changes haven't been made. During Abraham, God promised that the border would go to the Euphrates River. Well, in Numbers and Ezekiel, the Euphrates River are not mentioned in the borders. Well, that may be because the Euphrates River doesn't exist during the Millennium Kingdom, because during the tribulation the Euphrates River dries up. And that will allow the armies of the east to come in to prepare for Armageddon. But the Euphrates River has dried up, and it's not mentioned as a border in the detailed border description in Numbers and in Ezekiel. Did that catch everybody up? So we've divided it up, but now we're going to divide the borders. We got the outer outline of the borders, and you can see that in Ezekiel 48. And then we're going to go further into detail and see, or maybe 47, and see how it was divided among the tribes. So there's 12 tribes of Israel. The land will be divided up equally among the tribes. Ezekiel 47, 13 through 14. Thus saith the Lord God, this shall be the border whereby ye shall inherit the land according to the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph shall have 2 portions, and ye shall inherit it, one as well as another. So that phrase, one as well as another, will be equal. Everyone will have equal portions in the promised land. If you notice, during the time of Joshua, when the tribes inherited, they did not get equal portions of land. They were given land according to their population. So Manasseh, Judah, Ephraim, they had larger populations than the rest of the tribes. So they got a larger portion of the land. Those with smaller populations, looking at Zebulun and Issachar, they had smaller portions given to them.
I'm sorry, I got confused. Why do we have? I know that the 2 tribes went on this side.
Yes.
But how come we have them on this side too?
Why we have them here?
Manasseh?
Yeah, 2.5. So half a tribe of Manasseh was on the west side, on the east side, and half a tribe was on the west side.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's how big the population was.
Okay.
Right. And the reason this is not given to them, promised to them, but Israel had conquered the land because they would not allow them to come through. So they asked. They were not intending to conquer the land. They were just wanting to pass through, but they refused. And so, well, there was a battle and they won. And so Reuben, Gad, and half a tribe of Manasseh went to Moses and said, can we have this land? And so they settled and settled this land before Joshua conquered the rest of Israel. In fact, they had to, Moses had to tell them, and Joshua had to tell them that, well, they had to promise to Moses that you will participate in the battle. You will not leave your brothers behind. Here they've already settled in. They started building their houses, started having, settling their families and farms and buildings and so forth on this side of the river, well before the rest of Israel went in to conquer the rest of the land. He says, okay, you can have that land, but you must promise to come and fight with your rest of your brethren. Then they fulfilled that promise, and then when the land was conquered, they were allowed to return back to the land. But this did cause some issues. There's some other stories of them doing things on this side of the river that seemed a bit odd to those on the west side of the river, and so there was almost a civil war because of that. And we were getting a whole bunch of different issues here. But there's some great stories of the conquering land back then. We are in the Millennial Kingdom. I can talk about this if you want, but we're in the Millennial Kingdom. So this is just to point out that in the Millennial Kingdom, the tribes will have equal portions. During the time of Joshua and Moses, they were given by proportion. Does that make sense? So if you think of the House of Representatives, we're given representatives by the size of the population of our state. Florida continues to grow, so we continue to have more representation in Congress. This is like the Senate, where everyone has equal representation. That's probably not a good analogy here, but there we go. So I'm pointing out here, they'll have equally divided among the tribes. We know that the land will be distributed by lot. So in other words, casting of dice. This is what was done during the time of Joshua also. It was also divided by lots. We know that sometimes God makes decisions by us casting lots. So for those of you watching the football games this afternoon, if you notice the two team captains come up with the referee and they have a little discussion and they flip a coin. And the one who wins the coin toss will determine which side they're going to start off the game with and which direction they'll be going. Well, ultimately the Lord has decided that already. And so the land will be distributed by lot, which is kind of odd to say because I'm already telling you who's going to get what, because the Bible already tells us. All right, that catches us up to where we ended up last week, right? All right, you should be on page 206.
Yep.
Okay.
You know that number B is, the letter B is missing?
Is it?
Well, the B will jump to C, Gentile.
Okay, well I added that midstream along the way.
Okay.
my notes are always adjusting and adding, so
okay.
I apologize. All right, so Gentiles. Let's go to Ezekiel 47:22. And it shall come to pass that ye shall divide it by lot for an inheritance unto you, and to the strangers that sojourn among you, which shall beget children among you, and they shall be unto you as born in the country among the children of Israel. They shall have an inheritance with you among the tribes of Israel. And it shall come to pass that in what tribe the stranger sojourneth, they shall give him his inheritance, saith the Lord. Who's the stranger here?
Gentile.
Gentiles. Yes, Gentiles. Well, look at this. During the time, if you own land in this area, it's not going to be taken away from you. You're going to be welcomed into that land and given that your inheritance. You own the land, you live there, if you reside there, that is your land. And God's going to honor that. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? He's not going to say, get on out, you're not a part of the Jewish people, get on out. You'll be, if you own land here in Lebanon, like many Lebanese people would do, welcome. You are now part of the tribe of Dan. This is your property. We honor your property, but you are now within the nation of Israel.
Question.
Yeah.
That reserve set apart.
Yeah.
Is that in the Palestinian area right
Yeah.
now?
Oh, right now?
Where is it? Yeah. Where is that located now?
It's just
The
Jerusalem.
Palestinian.
Basically Jerusalem. This
Yeah.
will be the new. Yeah. So if you're West Bank, that's what you're looking
that's
for.
what I was. I
Yeah.
was thinking.
Yeah. So
So that's right in that area, right?
Yes.
That's what I thought.
right. So this part over here is Israel, and that part over here is West Bank, half of Jerusalem. You know, they're fighting over half of Jerusalem to be capital of Palestine.
So set apart for what?
Yes, we'll be talking about that.
Okay.
The answer to that is the temple and Jerusalem, but a lot of other things. So we got a lot to talk about. All right. So right now, the invitation for non-Jewish people. This is an invitation for non-Jewish people to live in the land. Is not new. God commanded His people to love the foreigners. The difference is the law did not permit foreign ownership of land as the millennial kingdom will. There is no condition that they be believers. Now when the millennial kingdom starts, they will only believers, but children will be born who eventually will not accept Christ. So if you own land here, you'll be honored it. You'll be honored that land. You'll be welcome to live there. You'll be welcome to continue to reside there, have your families there. But there is no requirement for you to be a believer when you're living there. Of course, the only ones entering the millennial kingdom will be believers. So those who have children will eventually, not accept Christ. They'll have their choice. So there'll be unbelievers in there. What I'm pointing out here is this is not something new. So Deuteronomy 10:19, love ye therefore the stranger, for ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. God has always commanded the Jewish people to love the foreigners, love the strangers. Leviticus 19:33, and if a stranger sojourn with thee in your land, ye shall not vex him. But the stranger that dwelleth with you shall be unto you as one born among you, and thou shalt love him as thyself, for ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Amazing, right? Amazing. Numbers 15:29. Ye shall have one law for him that sinneth through ignorance, both for him that is born among the children of Israel, and for the stranger that sojourneth among them. But the soul that doth aught presumptuously, whether he be born in the land or a stranger, the same reproacheth the Lord, and that soul shall be cut off from among his people. Because he hath despised the word of the Lord, and he hath broken his commandment, that soul shall utterly be cut off, his iniquity shall be upon him. Let's think about it as the United States. We're a melting pot. Everyone's welcomed in. We welcome people in. But if you're not going to participate in what the United States believes, you are removed. You should be removed. Okay? If you're not going to join up with the Constitution, we'll just go right to the Constitution. You're not going to follow the Constitution. You're not going to follow our laws, the rules of the land, and you're not going to be able-abiding United States citizen. You shouldn't be here. You should be removed. Same way here with Israel. You are welcomed in. Foreigners are welcomed in. Foreigners are welcome to live here, work here, reside here, right in the nation of Israel. Welcome. But if you're not going to participate in the law, you'll be removed. Just as if you were a citizen, if you're a Jewish person or a non-Jewish person, you're cut off from the people. In other words, you're deported. Deported. That's the way the law was. That's the way Israel was under Joshua. That's the law. The law continues here with the millennial kingdom. Welcomed in. Welcome them. During an interview in 1989, Ariel Sharon was asked, do you think, Ariel Sharon was the prime minister of Israel back in 1989, do you think the Arabs as your friends, neighbors, or your enemies? He replied, from my childhood I have believed Jews and Arabs can live together, and I believe now they should live together. All the rights to this country, to the land of Israel, especially Judea and Samaria, are Jewish. But everyone who lives in the country should have all the rights of the country. Everyone follow that statement? So, this is Israel. If you live in Israel, you have all the rights of Israel. Now, there's been all kinds of discussion about the Palestinian people. When 1948, when Israel became a nation, there were people removed. They were removed because they left. It's not because the nation of Israel removed them. Now they're saying we've conquered, Israel has conquered the land and has taken over the land and has displaced people. That is a lie.
They left to join the enemies to go fight against Israel.
Yes. And the Palestinian people, and that's a whole other discussion of that term Palestinian, but the Palestinian people left thinking they could come back, they would come back in after it was conquered. Well, their neighboring nations, Jordan, and they didn't welcome them either. So they had left thinking that they would come back. but they were not welcome in the neighboring nations. So it has created decades and decades of issues. But Israel, if you want to be a law-abiding Israeli citizen, welcome. Welcome. But if you don't, we got problems. And now there's walls and tunnels and all kinds of things going on here. So the Millennial Kingdom, if you own land, if you own land through the tribulation period, and you're living there, and you're not Jewish, welcome. Your land is still yours. You're welcome. All right, so that's a very interesting fact about Israel. All right, so Ezekiel 48:1. Now these are the names of the tribes from the north end of the coast of the way of Hethlon. One goes to Hamath, Hazran, to the border of Damascus northward, to the coast of Hamath, for these are his sides, and west a portion. So I'm pointing out from that verse here, is for these are his sides, east and west. Notice that the previous, or the inheritance among Joshua, it's all kind of scattered. There's neighboring, neighboring tribes, tribes within tribes, and all kinds of things. This verse indicates to us your portion will be equal, and it will go from west to east, or east to west. Yeah, are his sides east and west. So that's why this graphic is all equal and goes from one side, one board to the other. Even though that's very geometrical, symmetrical, right? Whereas this is like all kinds of all over the place. So they'll have equal, they'll go from west to east. So tribes, yeah.
So the Palestinians on the other side of Jordan, they might have a point, but not where they're living.
No, that's right. That's right. Yeah, and I also want to bring up a point. If God sets borders, you don't go outside those borders. If God has also promised land to neighboring nations. Israel doesn't have a right to that land. So Israel's not in a conquering mode. This is what Israel has been, or this is what God has promised Israel, and only that, both in the past and in the Millennial Kingdom. All right, Ezekiel 48:1-7. This is just a bunch of list of the tribes, and so this is how we know why this is set up like this. Okay, Ezekiel 48:1-7. These are the names of the tribes of the north end, so north end, to the coast of the way of Hethlon, as one goeth to Maass. Yeah, here we go. As one goeth to Maass, Hazran, the border of Damascus northward to the coast of Maass. So we're talking about the northern end. This is where the description of the northern end. From these are his sides, east and west, a portion of Dan. So going Dan. And by the border of Dan, from the east side unto the west side, a portion for Asher. And the border of Asher, from the east side unto the west side, a portion for Naphtali. And by the border of Naphtali, from the east side unto the west side, a portion for Manasseh. And a portion for, by the border of Manasseh, from the east side unto the west side, a portion for Ephraim. And by the border of Ephraim, from the east side unto the west side, a portion for Reuben. And by the border of Reuben, from the east side unto the west side, a portion for Judah. So the northern tribes will be listed in that order from north to south. So that's how this graphic is based off of these verses here. One thing we should note is that Dan, the tribe of Dan, Dan fell into idolatry very quickly underneath Joshua. In fact, Dan, underneath the promised land, was given land over here. Well, they didn't like it, so they decided to move, and they moved up here. The entire tribe just moved. And they fell into idolatry. They're the first ones to fall badly. So they're not included. They're not included in the 144,000 witnesses during the tribulation period. The 144,000 witnesses is a reminder when we as a church are raptured. At that moment, the Holy Spirit's not here because there's nobody for the Holy Spirit to indwell. But the Lord causes the nation of Israel to be witnesses for him so that there'll be salvation, so that there'll be a huge revival. He's going to use Israel to reach the world and convert them to Christ. Now, most of the world will not, but they'll still be a witness. So the 144,000 will be his witnesses, and the 144,000 is made up of 12,000 of each of the tribes, except the tribe of Dan. Dan is not included in those witnesses. So that occurs in Revelation chapter 7, verses 4 through 8, the whole listing of all the tribes that make up the 144,000. So we think that because Dan was the first tribe to go into idolatry, they were not included. But here, during the millennial kingdom, Dan is given an inheritance. Dan is still remembered and given an inheritance. So what does that mean? God's grace is wonderful. So God has wiped out the past and has presented Dan with the first distribution of the inheritance in the millennial kingdom. One thing we also know, you kind of have to know who is... you remember Jacob had 4 wives? Well, 2 wives and 2 concubines. And who was born of whom? Anybody knew who was the firstborn child of Jacob was? Reuben. Reuben was. And who was his mother? Leah. That's right, Leah. So here we have, and interesting how they are placed around this reserved portion, which is where the temple will be. So the closest to the temple, that's the primus of land, right? You're closest to the dwelling of the Lord, where the throne of the Lord. So Reuben, Judah, Judah is going to be the closest. Judah, of course, is where the Lord came from. The tribe of the Lord. That's where Judah is. And then we know Benjamin is on the other, going to be south on the southern side of the temple, and he is the one of the favorites of Jacob. He was the second son of Rachel. We have Reuben. We also, I forgot to point out that Joseph will have a double portion. So that's Manasseh and Ephraim. Those are Joseph's 2 sons, born of. So Rachel is the mother of Joseph, and Joseph had 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Joseph was given a double portion from his father as inheritance, and so that is laid out here with Ephraim and Manasseh. So Judah to the north, and we see Benjamin to the south, be the closest to the center of Israel.
Real quick,
Yeah.
where did that other 12,000 come from if it didn't come from Dan?
Levi, the Lord. So Levi is going to have an inheritance within the reserved portion to the Lord. So when we talk about 12 tribes, those 12 fluctuate a little bit because Levi is one of the original 12, but he's not going to get an inheritance.
Yeah.
Joseph
That's
is a part of the original, but he's going to have a double inheritance.
Yeah.
Yes. So depending on how you're talking, depends on how that 12 is made up.
Gotcha.
There's 12 sons of Jacob, but at some point Levi falls off from an inheritance and Joseph picks up a double portion. So that's where 12 comes in from the inheritance state. But the 12 tribes include Levi. Yes. And then we find here during the 144,000 witnesses, Dan is excluded, but Levi is included, and Manasseh and Ephraim are included. Everyone following the math?
Yeah.
All right, verse 8. Ezekiel 48, verse 8. And by the border of Judah, so by the border of Judah, let's go to, here we go. By the border of Judah, from the east side unto the west side shall be the offering, which ye shall offer of 25,000 reeds in breadth, and in length as one of the other parts, and from the east side unto the west side, and the sanctuary shall be in the midst of it. So we're talking about the land that's south of Judah. And so this land here will go from the east side to the west side, just like all the others. And it shall be an offering, which ye shall offer, and we're giving the breadth of it. The breadth of it. We don't. This distance here kind of fluctuates with the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. But we know the breadth of it. So this breadth here is noted as what? 25,000 reeds. 25,000 reeds. And in length is one of the other parts from the east side unto the west side, and the sanctuary shall be in the midst of it. So the temple is going to be in the midst of this reserved portion that is 25,000 feet in breadth, not feet, 25,000 reeds in breadth. So what's your next question on your mind?
Yeah, well, how much
What's a
is
reed?
this one?
Okay, there we go. I knew what you were going to ask next. So read, Ezekiel 40 verse 5 says, "And behold, a wall on the outside of the house round about, and in the man's hand a measuring reed," all right, so this reed, "a measuring reed of 6 cubits long by a cubit and a handbreadth, so he shall measure the building 1 reed and the height 1 reed." So that verse, I'm just pointing out the verse here. What is a reed? Well, a reed is 6 cubits. So we have addition of a reed as 6 cubits. Well, what's a cubit? Well, a cubit by definition is from your elbow to the tip of your finger. Elbow to your tip of your finger. Now, this is a different cubit than what I'm talking about. This is a normal cubit by definition. This cubit here is going to be called a royal, let's see, do I even have it? Well, this is calling it a Hebrew long. It's a long cubit or a royal cubit. So it's a longer than a normal cubit, and we see that definition here. Ezekiel 40 verse 5. So, and in the man's hand a measuring reed of 6 cubits long by the cubit and a handbreadth. So it's 6 cubits long, but then we find out this cubit is a cubit and a handbreadth. Handbreadth. So what's a handbreadth? A handbreadth, of course, is the breadth of your hand. Breadth of your hand. So, all right, so let me have a hand here. Hold up. Oh my goodness, mine is longer. I have a longer cubit. Well, this creates a problem. How do we know what the length is on a standard? What's the standard cubit? Because Lupe and I have different standards. Well, we have different measuring, way we measure. I'm pretty embarrassed. Mine's way longer. So we have. This is what we're going to use, and this is what research has shown, and it kind of varies, and it kind of varies by culture also, what that is, what that standard is. And so when I went to the Ark Encounter, they had this as one of the souvenirs, as a definition of a cubit. So this is what the standard, this is the standardized cubit that the Ark Encounter is using, that the Ark Answers in Genesis has research, and this is what they're using. So this is 20.4 inches in length as a standard. Now we'll use, as our standard, a cubit as 18 inches and a handbreadth of 3 inches. So we'll use, just as a round, 21 inches as our cubit, or as our royal cubit. And so 21 inches times 6 cubits, remember it's going to be 6 of these, makes up a reed. So if you see someone with a big pole, that as a reed, a standard reed, instead of measuring, clearly we have a yardstick, but this is a bigger than the yardstick. So this would measure 21 inches by times 6, which is 126 inches, which is 10.5 feet. So we're going to use a reed as 10.5.
And the royal cubit was how many inches?
A royal cubit,
21.
so 21 plus 3, 24. I mean 18 plus 3, excuse me. 18 plus 3, there we go. 18 plus 3, 21 inches. Thank you. There's all. Oh my goodness. And so a span is, we call a span 4 inches.